Hello everybody. In this video we're going to talk about two ways that groups can affect our performance. Specifically, we're going to talk about the process known as social facilitation, and we're going to talk about the process known as social loafing. All right, because groups can both help us perform better and they can help us perform worse. But the contexts in which we're identifiable, the contexts in which the group is performing, those contexts can shape exactly how the group can enhance our performance or impair our performance. So I'm going to share my screen with you. All right, here we go. So first, we're going to talk about how the group can affect individual performance through the process of social facilitation. So in general, social facilitation refers to when the presence of a group or observation by a group, either observation or presence, so you can either be co-performing or you can be being watched, all right? Where the co-presence of a group tends to aid or facilitate simple or well-practiced tasks, but tends to impair or it tends to make you perform worse or more poorly at tasks that are either more complex or not well practiced. All right, so again, behaviors that are simple or well practiced, they are facilitated. We tend to do better at those kinds of tasks in the presence of others. Whereas tasks that are more difficult or at least more complex and not as well practiced, so poorly practiced, those tend to be impaired. Those tend to be harmed when in the presence of others. Now, this process of social facilitation, why does it occur? Well, it's thought to occur because we become concerned with the evaluations of others. Now, that's only one of at least three potential explanations, and we're going to come back to those explanations in a little bit. But essentially, Zients is the guy who did a lot of the work in social facilitation, and most of this work is largely classic. So as you can see, the figure here there on the right is from a study of Zients's that he published in the 60s. And so what we see here are the results, or the averaged results, from a study in which he tried to train participants how to pronounce these foreign words. I forget the exact language, but it was a word in a foreign language, a series of words in foreign language. Now, he varied how many times participants had a chance to practice each of, I think it was 10 words. So, for example, you can see here in the figure, some things, some words they were given one chance to practice, other words they were given 2, 4, 6, or 16 chances to practice. So he varied how many times the participants were able to practice each of these words in a foreign language. All right. And so we can think about this as, down here with the 1 and 2, even up to 4, participants aren't well practiced at pronouncing these words. But up here at 8 and 10, or sorry, not 10, 16, especially at that 16, they're fairly well practiced. All right. Zients then had participants try to pronounce these words after being shown them randomly on a projector, and he had them do that either alone, and specifically alone meaning in the room with only the experimenter, or with other students, other participants who Zients told them had asked if they could watch the experiment, and so they just came in to sit. All right, and he made sure to ensure that these students, these observers, didn't respond to the participants' reaction in any way. They were just there watching. Okay. And so plotted on the y-axis there, right here, is the average number of time they correctly gave the right response. So the number of times when shown the words, all right, and they were shown the words very quickly. So, you know, there's an added element of error there. They could missee the word. But they looked at the number of times the participant correctly pronounced the word after seeing it. Okay, so again, there were 10 words, and participants saw those words either 1 time, 2 times, 4 times, 8 times, or 16 times in a training session. And then in the testing session, they were shown each of these words, and they had to pronounce those words correctly. Now, again, remember that some participants did this with only the experimenter in the room, and other participants did this with other students in the room. Okay. And what we see here is that, yeah, as the number of as the number of times participants were allowed to train each word grows, they get better. All right. Yeah, they are able to pronounce those words better. But what we want to focus on here and how we see social facilitation is in the difference between those two lines. Okay, so when we look here at when participants were only given 1 or 2 times to practice the word, the solid line represents when they were trying to do this in the presence of others. And notice that the black line, the solid line, when they were trying to pronounce these words in the presence of others, is lower than this dashed line, which represents when they were trying to pronounce those words by themselves without other students watching them. But let's look at the high end of this line, right? So again, the black line is when they were trying to pronounce these words in the presence of others. And note that this dot right here, when they've practiced the word 16 times, right? So it's well practiced. When they're in the presence of others, they pronounce that word far more successfully than do those who practiced it the same amount, but they're trying to pronounce it by themselves, meaning there are no observers, again, other than the experimenter. So that's social facilitation. When the task is simple or at least poorly practiced, as it is here when they only had 1 or 2 times to practice it, the presence of others impairs performance, makes performance worse. But up here, when they've had the opportunity to practice something quite a bit, so it's a well-practiced task, right? Because they practice it 16 times. When it's a well-practiced task, they tend to do better in the presence of others than when by themselves. So we get social facilitation. Performance is increased when in the presence of others. Performance on well-practiced tasks is facilitated when in the presence of others, but poorly practiced tasks are impaired in the presence of others. Okay. Now, again, why might that be? So, you know, earlier I mentioned that it's thought to be because of evaluation apprehension, but why would evaluation apprehension do anything? Well, Zients offered the explanation that when we're in the presence of others, it increases our state of physiological arousal. And when that physiological arousal is heightened, our dominant responses are facilitated, whereas our subordinate responses are impaired. And so something that we've practiced a lot becomes a dominant response. You can think of it like a habit. In fact, if you look in this graph, you see habit strength, right? So think about, when you first started to learn a new sport or even a basic skill like throwing a ball, right? Or writing, right? Any of these, if you can remember back as far to the time when you first learned to do it, riding a bike, right? When you think back to the first times you were learning to do these things, you made a lot of mistakes, right? So riding a bike, throwing a ball, writing, all right, these when you were first learning to do them, they were not your dominant responses. All right, they were more of a subordinate response. You had to put a lot of time and attention into performing them. And so, but after you learned it, after you practiced it quite a bit, right? Then suddenly, you know, in fact, the expression there's the expression, it's like riding a bike, right? Meaning that even if you take a long time before you learn to ride a bike, and then you don't ride a bike for years, it's like riding a bike. You can jump back on and start riding again, because once you've learned it, performing that behavior is the dominant response. Okay, so a dominant response is either something that's very simple, like me flailing my hands around up here, all right, or something that's well practiced. All right, so as in the study, they used practice to differentiate between dominant and subordinate response. So when something was well practiced, when pronouncing a word was well practiced, that becomes a dominant response. When it was poorly practiced, that's a subordinate response. All right. So Zients makes the argument that when arousal goes up, dominant responses are facilitated, subordinate responses are impaired. And this is why social facilitation, according to Zients, occurs. Now, earlier, I mentioned evaluation apprehension increases arousal, but that may not be the only reason that the presence of others increases our arousal. In fact, that's only one of the explanations that's been offered over the years. So yeah, we have evaluation apprehension, but another explanation that's been offered as to why the presence of others increases our arousal is that, excuse me, please, other people introduce an element of uncertainty into the environment. We don't necessarily know what those other folks are going to do. And so by virtue of other people being around, uncertainty grows. And one reoccurring message from social psych is that people don't like uncertainty. It makes them uncomfortable. All right. And so simply the presence of others introduces an element of uncertainty into our environment, raising that baseline level or raising that level of arousal. So that's a second explanation. And a third explanation is simply the fact that other people being around creates additional distractions. All right. They may be shuffling in their seats or simply breathing, right? They may be doing things that increases the number of things that can distract us. And so that splits our attention. And it's thought that that splitting of attention raises arousal. And so whether we're talking about evaluation apprehension, you're apprehensive, you're worried about how someone might evaluate you, whether it's increased uncertainty created by the presence of others because you just don't know what they're going to do, or the distraction that they may cause because of the little things they may do, whether arousal grows for each of these reasons, once arousal grows, well-practiced tasks are facilitated, poorly practiced tasks are impaired. But it seems the degree to which someone can be identified also seems to be identified, meaning the extent to which they can be identified as the reason for the behavior. Their individual ability can be recognized. The degree to which their individual ability can be identified is another variable that seems to flip the whole thing. Specifically, when people can't be identified, it seems that they tend to socially loaf. When an individual's contribution goes down, it seems that they socially loaf. And so we see an exact flipping of what we saw with social facilitation. So social loafing, and Latane is one of the folks that did most of the work, or at least a lot of the work concerning social loafing. Social loafing occurs when the performance of simple tasks in a group is impaired, whereas the performance of more complex tasks in a group are facilitated. So it's the exact opposite of social facilitation. And one of the key differences seems to be whether or not the individual's performance can be identified. All right. You know, so when we're talking about social facilitation, they're looking at the performance of the individual. The individual can be evaluated. But what about when the individual can't? Supposedly that's when social loafing occurs. So when that evaluation apprehension is completely removed, the worry that a person might have about being evaluated as an individual is removed. This is when evaluation apprehension is thought to occur. So what you see to the right there are the results or a visual representation of the results from a study that Latane did with some colleagues. In this study, and this was one of two in that particular article, reported in that particular article. In this study, they had participants, or they told participants they were looking at basically sonic output. You know, how much how loudly they could shout. And so they set participants in the situation where they put them in a soundproofed room. They had headsets and blindfolds on, so they couldn't see who was actually shouting, and the headsets were meant to prevent their ability to detect who was and was not actually shouting. And they put participants in groups of 6 with these headphones on and these blindfolds on. They then asked participants to either yell by themselves, in pairs, or in the entire group of 6. And they had measurement devices to measure the sonic output. So the sound pressure changes. Now, what you see here, in this condition here, they were told that there was no mic on them, and they were told that they couldn't be individually evaluated. All right, and so sometimes they were asked to shout as loudly as possible by themselves. All right, and this top line with the squares, right, that top line, it looks like the top of the graph, that plots their sonic output when yelling by themselves. All right. Then they had certain situations where they asked pairs or groups of 6 to all shout. Again, the instructions didn't change. They were asked to shout as loudly as they could. All right. That is this line with the dark circles. All right. And you notice that when it goes from them shouting by themselves to, and this line is largely generated. So what would the sonic output be if their performance as individuals was just summed up, right? So how much sonic output would there be if 2 people had legitimately shouted at the same volume that they did when they shouted by themselves, if 2 of them shouted at the same time and 6 of them shouted at the same time? So this line is created simply by adding them up. All right, so this is the sonic output generated by 1 individual. This is that sonic output of 2 of them added up and 3 of them added up. But so this was calculated. This top line is not a reflection of their actual output. Their actual output in groups is down here. All right. So when pairs actually shouted together, their individual sonic output plummeted. When groups of 6 shouted together, the individual output plummeted even further. But Latane and colleagues said, well, when the real groups were asked to shout, there's the possibility of things like coordination loss. So basically, they may have shouted at slightly different times. One might have started and then stopped before another started. And so you might have gotten this drop in average sonic output just because they weren't shouting at the same time. And so to deal with that, they created another condition where the participants were led to believe that they were going to shout in pairs or in groups of 6, and then had them shout. And they did things in the headset to make them believe that they were shouting with another person or with 5 other people. And so what we see is when they thought they were shouting with one other person but weren't, their sonic output did drop. All right. And then when they believed they were shouting with 6 other people but weren't, it dropped slightly again. So if they thought that they were shouting alone, we see this high sonic output. If they thought they were shouting with one other person but weren't, their individual output dropped a lot. And if they thought they were shouting with 5 other people, it dropped a little bit more. But then in another condition, they put a mic in front of participants. Now, the mics were unable to actually identify individual sonic output. All right, so the way they were able to calculate individual sonic output in the group conditions is they were able to measure total sonic output, so how much everybody was yelling or shouting, and then they just calculated how much each individual in that condition would be contributing. So in pairs, they just divided the total sonic output they measured by 2, and in 6s they just divided the total sonic output of the group by 6, and that's how they get these numbers. But in this condition, there was no mic in front of them. There was just the measurement device for the room, and so the participants didn't believe that they could be individually identified. But what happens when they are, or when they believe they can be individually identified? That's what we see in these results over here. So they were then given a mic and told that the mic would be able to register their individual contribution. All right. So again, that top line is just made up, right? So this black line, this dot right here in the top left corner, that's real. All right. So again, asked each individual to yell as loudly as they can by themselves. They then, in order to calculate up this square, which you can barely see back here, they added up what 2 people's individual shouting output would be. And then to calculate this one, they added up what 6 individual outputs would have been. So again, they created this situation where 2 people would shout or 6 people would shout, where 2 people would actually shout together or 6 people would actually shout together. When 2 people would actually shout together and they thought that their individual output could be identified, their output dropped a little bit, but not as much as over here when they couldn't be identified. And then when 6 people were shouting together, all right, but each individual could be identified, it dropped quite a bit, almost as much as when they couldn't be identified. But again, remember that it's possible that there was coordination loss. Again, remember, if me and 6 other people are told to shout as loudly as we can on the count of 3, there could be, you could start shouting and finish before I even begin. And so the total amount of sonic output plummets. So that's why they created that condition where the participants were led to believe that they would be yelling with another person or with 5 other people. And so when they were led to believe, but didn't actually, when they were led to believe that they would be shouting with somebody else and that their individual output could be identified, there wasn't a big difference in how loudly they yelled by themselves. Even when they were led to believe that they would be yelling with 6 other people, again, even when they were led to believe that they'd be yelling with 6 other people, when they could be identified, they didn't yell much softer or much quieter than what they would have by themselves. All right. So this dark area right here, it's labeled social loafing because this decrement, this decline in performance is a consequence of believing that they could not be identified and that they would be their individual contribution could not be identified and that they were performing with other people. Here, though, you notice that this black area here or shaded area is much smaller when they could not, or when they believed that they could be identified. All right, so that's social loafing. So why is that happening? Well, over here, when they didn't think that their individual contribution could be identified, there's no, or there's very limited, or there's less evaluation apprehension. There's less concern, apprehension, about how other people will judge them, evaluate them. All right. So when that relaxation that comes from not being worried about what others think comes, then input on simplistic tasks like this drop. All right. There's less anxiety, right? And that can impair performance on simplistic tasks. But what about these complex tasks, right? Because remember, I mentioned that on complex tasks, social loafing impair or enhances performance. Well, it goes back again to the relaxation, the reduction of anxiety. All right, when you're performing this complex task and you're doing it in a group, but individual performance can't be identified, then the reduction in anxiety that can be caused by being evaluated individually can free up people, because that anxiety isn't there, or at least it's there to a lesser extent. It's not going to impair their ability to think or focus on the potentially difficult task at hand. All right. Now, how does everybody loaf equally? Well, no. Quite a bit of research suggests that women tend to care more about their groups. They tend to care about forming harmonious relationships a little bit more. And as a reflection of that, what we often find is that women loaf less, right? They don't tend to, I guess, rely on their other group members. They don't put the burden on their group members as much as men do, all right? Also, we see that Eastern cultures, those cultures more committed to their groups, they're more focused on maintaining their groups. Eastern cultures also loaf less than Western cultures like ours and European cultures. All right, guys, and that is our discussion of social facilitation and social loafing. So again, with social facilitation, the presence of others facilitates simple or well-practiced tasks, but impairs complex or poorly practiced tasks. And it's thought because the presence of others increases arousal, facilitating dominant responses, but impairing subordinate responses. But with social loafing, this occurs in the context of not being able to in the context of one's individual performance not being able to be identified. And so in that context, in the context of individual performance not being able to be identified, the presence of a group can impair performance on simple tasks, but facilitate performance on complex tasks, all right, because of the relaxation of anxiety, right, that comes from being evaluated. Because again, with social loafing, individual performance can't be identified, all right? And so because my individual performance can't be identified, if it's a simple task, I'm not going to try to contribute as much. But if it's a complex task, because there's not as much anxiety, I can focus, I can think a little bit more about the task because it's not being distracted by all that anxiety. All right. All right, guys, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you later on.